Today, we're going to be talking about Issei Sagawa, a killer known as the Kobe Cannibal. This is, as you might suspect, a rather disturbing topic. If you're sensitive to such issues, please stop listening now. June 13th, 1981, in Paris. It's an otherwise serene and balmy day at Bois de Boulogne Park, a densely wooded and usually serene place with a popular and crowded island restaurant. Not far from the restaurant, a small and frail Japanese man sleeps on a park bench. He's not homeless, merely exhausted from a long trip through the park, carrying 2 heavy suitcases. He sits down to rest near the water's edge and, despite his best intentions, he falls asleep. One of his suitcases is bleeding. Noticing this as he left the restaurant, an elderly Parisian local crept forward and boldly, bravely, inspected the suitcase and opened it. His screams woke the sleeping owner a moment later. This is what happened. Issei Sagawa was born in 1949 in Kobe, in the Hyogo Prefecture of Japan, to wealthy parents. He was raised in a strict, traditional Japanese household. His father, Akira Sagawa, was a very successful businessman who served as the president of Kurita Water Industries. His mother stayed at home, raising both Issei and his younger brother. Issei had the misfortune of being born frail and prone to sickness. A premature birth, he could reportedly fit in the palm of his father's hand when he was born. He was often unwell as a boy and frequently required hospital care. His parents and family were incredibly overprotective of Issei as a result. In the words of Sagawa himself, "My parents tried to protect me too much. I was very weak, very ugly, like a small monkey." Puberty and the onset of teenage years are a difficult time for anyone, but for Sagawa it was particularly unusual, as with the changes in his physiology, he also started having cannibalistic desires. He would dream and fantasize about consuming the flesh of his classmates. As years passed and he grew older, Sagawa became enamored with Western women and Western beauty standards. Pale skin, tall, blue eyes, blonde hair, and so on. This so-called admiration spun into an obsession with everything that was the opposite of how he saw himself: frail, weak, and ugly. While Sagawa would never excel in anything physical, he was, by all accounts, a good student and intelligent. As he grew older, he attended university in Tokyo, working his way, eventually, to a master's degree in English literature. But, at the age of 23, while living with his parents, a German girl with the good looks of a model moved into his neighborhood. Sagawa's obsession with Western beauty standards had him instantly enthralled by this young woman, and he was, for the first time, determined to follow through on the perverse and taboo desires that had followed him for his entire life. He decided to sneak into the girl's room with the intention of consuming part of the flesh of her buttocks. He didn't intend to kill her, or so he says. For a man who was supposedly intelligent, Sagawa's plan, such as it was bizarre. He was equipped only with an umbrella and a rubber Frankenstein Halloween mask to try to disguise his identity. Creeping in through her window, he approached her bedside while she slept. Standing there, shifting nervously, staring at her, he inadvertently bumped her with his knee. The girl awoke and screamed. Sagawa tried to flee the scene, but despite having brought an umbrella, he was very easily overpowered by the woman. Sagawa was arrested and charged with attempted rape. He made no confession to the police about his desire to cannibalize the woman. He thought it would be better if people thought he was there to assault her instead. Sagawa's father, an extremely powerful and influential man, paid the German girl an undisclosed sum to drop the charges. Issei Sagawa never went to jail for this crime. Ashamed and perplexed by Issei's behavior, his father forced him to see a psychiatrist. By all accounts, Issei was quite open with this psychiatrist, speaking frankly to him about his desires and what had led him to that poor German woman's room that night. The psychiatrist found that Issei was extremely dangerous and very likely to reoffend. No action was ever taken to prevent this. Issei Sagawa went back to his studies. 5 years later, after achieving his master's degree, he flew to Paris, leaving the overbearing supervision of his parents behind. He would study there for his doctorate in English literature at the prestigious Sorbonne University in Paris, France. He was once again thought to be an extraordinary and excellent student, though, by his own admission, he lacked social skills. Very rarely did he speak with other students or go out and enjoy the nightlife of the city. Of course, Sagawa's disturbing fascinations had not left him. He was still preoccupied with Western women and, much more disturbingly, had regular fantasies of consuming human flesh. Of course, for him, these two things went hand in hand. While he had been living in Tokyo, the opportunities for such things were relatively rare. There were not a great number of Western women living in Tokyo in the 70s and 80s. Far from it. But Paris was filled with beautiful, young, white women, the kind that were the tragic catalysts for Sagawa's perverse desires. Living there, far from the influence of his parents and completely unsupervised, it was only a matter of time before the worst should happen. In 1981, a young woman named Renee Hartfeld joined his class. She was a foreign student to the university herself, being Dutch. Young, white, beautiful, tall and strong, she was everything that Sagawa was obsessed with. He even sketched a portrait of her upon their first meeting. He was so taken by her beauty. In addition to being an attractive young woman, she was quite intelligent, warm, convivial, and accommodating. She went out of her way to be kind to Issei, not seeming to realize how completely enamored of her he was. She even invited him on a night out with her friends from the university, something that Sagawa had always been excluded from in the past. To him, it was like a sign. He had never felt so welcomed by someone, and it left a huge impression on him. He would describe her later as very kind, open-hearted, and open-minded. In a letter that Renee wrote to her parents, she described her time with Sagawa and their budding friendship, how she had enjoyed her dinner with him and meeting him. It was that night that Sagawa began to plot the murder and consumption of Renee Hartfeld. In his own words, "Because of my cannibal desire, my personality was swallowed up by my obsession." Over the following weeks, he spent as much time with Renee as he could, strengthening their friendship and bond. He also purchased a rifle. Having learned and evolved from his previous unpunished offense, Issei knew he could not overpower a woman of Renee's size. He was also, in his own words, too much of a coward to shoot her while she could see him. And so his plan formed. Knowing that Renee spoke German, he would invite her to his room to read a German poem, claiming that he needed a tape recording of it for one of his classes, and it would be better from a German speaker. He even offered to pay her for this service. Renee accepted. When she sat down to read the poem that Sagawa had selected, a German poem on the topic of cannibalism, he crept up behind her with the rifle. Renee Hartfeld was shot, point blank, in the back of the neck. She died instantly. The details of what occurred over the next 48 hours are some of the most disturbing I've ever heard. I have considered at length how much detail to include in this description. I don't like the idea of turning Renee Hartveld's death into sensationalism, or some kind of lurid voyeurism meant for entertainment. But ultimately, the horror of what happened to her must be described, or the weight of the events that follow will not hold the meaning that they should and must. Though I did warn you at the top of the episode, I would stress again that if you find this topic disturbing, if you find yourself already distressed, now is your cue to stop tempting fate. Do yourself the favor of not knowing what follows, and stop listening here. Sagawa had decided ahead of time to start, as before, by trying to consume her buttocks. He would say later on that he had thought biting into the flesh would immediately produce red meat. Of course, that's not how human bodies are constructed. Again, for someone supposedly quite bright, he was also incredibly dim. Sagawa found himself unable to bite deep enough and so resorted to using his hands, cutting and tearing. What he found beneath her skin he would later coldly, reverently describe as being like sweet corn, before he was eventually able to tear out pieces of her flesh with his fingers. It was after this that he left to purchase a butcher knife from a nearby shop. Over the next 48 hours, he consumed pieces of her breasts, face, thighs, feet, neck, and buttocks, cooked and raw both. He also assaulted her corpse. While he did this, he confessed to her for the first time that he loved her. He stockpiled mementos of every disgusting, inhuman feat, took photographs at every stage of this horrible act. He stored pieces of her in his fridge for later, and even had a hidden video camera that he used to record not just the murder, but everything else. 48 hours later, the remains of Renee Hartveld had begun to decompose. Sagawa decided that it was time to dispose of the remains of her body. He packed the remaining body parts into 2 heavy suitcases and went outside to hail a cab. The driver dropped him off outside Bois de Boulogne Park. There, in the broad light of day, this tiny Japanese student hauled 2 massive suitcases to the edge of the water. It's unclear exactly how he planned to do this without being spotted. The park was a popular destination in the summer, and the restaurant on the island was in plain view of where he seemed to intend to dump the suitcases. Though if Sagawa's past attempts at planning have taught us anything, it's that he's not very good at it, and not very bright when it comes to practicalities. Frail as he was exhausted from carrying the suitcases and sat down at a bench at the water's edge. Despite himself, he fell asleep. It was an elderly man leaving the island restaurant that noticed him, and noticed that one of his suitcases appeared to be leaking blood. The man crept forward to investigate and opened the suitcase. His screams woke Issei from his slumber. Knowing his horrible deeds had been uncovered, he stood and very calmly just walked away. When the police arrived minutes later, they quickly noticed evidence of cannibalism. And during the autopsy, the coroner inevitably discovered the post-mortem sexual abuse. Olivier Faure of the CID would describe what he saw in the simplest terms as appalling, nightmarish. Incensed, every moral and sensibility offended, the police launched a massive manhunt across Paris to find the killer of Renee Hartveld. The description of Issei Sagawa that was given by the man who had opened the suitcases, as well as the timing and the large bags, made its way very quickly to the taxi driver that had picked him up and driven him to the park. The man recalled Sagawa not just because of his unusual appearance, but because he was very surprised to drop someone with 2 large suitcases off at the park. He had expected to be taking him to the train station. Thanks to those leads and the hard work of Paris police, it took less than 4 days for Sagawa to be arrested outside of his Paris apartment. Sagawa immediately and calmly confessed to everything. Of course, it wouldn't have mattered. As soon as they entered the blood-soaked apartment of Sagawa, they found undeniable proof of what had happened. Not only the bloodstains, but he still had a fridge full of human flesh, the murder weapon, Renee's ID card, as well as dozens of photographs and even video footage of everything that took place. Sagawa was taken to be interrogated, where police say that he seemed almost keen or eager to confess and talk about what he had done. He gave horrible details, without regret, without remorse, and even without prompting. Some officers thought he seemed proud of himself. While this was going on, the story made headlines across both France and Japan. It was too horrible not to capture the darkest parts of everyone's imaginations. Awaiting trial, Sagawa was temporarily locked in a maximum security prison. In France, every case gets a forensic examination, as well as a psychological one. The psychological examination of Issei Sagawa took over a year to complete. In the official report, Sagawa was described as hung up on his height and physical frailty, lacking confidence, oversensitive, and emotionally cold and self-satisfied when talking about the murder. He was described as someone not capable of feeling guilt, of being devoid of some essential human emotions. The final report took into account his upbringing, as well as the calm and very public way he tried to dispose of the body. The conclusion? The French justice system decided that Issei Sagawa was insane, and thus mentally unfit to stand trial. Renee Hartveldt's family, of course, requested a second opinion be given, but their request was not granted. Sagawa's wealthy family employed the best lawyer that they could, a man named Philippe Lemaire. Sagawa would later credit this man with saving him from punishment. In the words of Philippe Lemaire himself, "I was in contact with the Department of the Interior and the Public Health Department. I told them I found it quite unfair that the French taxpayers must pay for the ongoing hospitalization of Issei Sagawa, in the sense that nothing could ever be done for him. And we should send him back to Japan so he could be hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital there and be cured." The French government somehow agreed. The only condition that they put on the transfer of Sagawa into the custody of Japan was that he was never allowed back into France. 34 months after his confession, Issei Sagawa was put on a plane and sent back to Japan. And that's where this entire tragedy gets even worse. Never having stood trial for a crime in France, he was found to be incapable of it. Sagawa was never technically sentenced to any particular punishment. And because he had not gone on trial and not been sentenced, the Japanese government had no legal right or precedent for locking him up or committing him to the care of a psychiatric institute. The moment Issei Sagawa set foot on Japanese soil, he was a free man. This was hidden from the press quite cleverly by Sagawa's father, who arranged for a completely voluntary stay at a Japanese psychiatric hospital. The hospital picked Sagawa up from the airport and drove him away. To the press who had been there taking pictures, it naturally looked like Sagawa was being taken by the government to be locked away or treated. He voluntarily stayed in the hospital for 18 months to give the appearance of being punished. Then, since it was voluntary, he simply left. French officials would claim to be shocked upon finding out, but he remained a free man, completely unsupervised. The deluge of well-earned negative press affected the health and well-being of his family. His brother developed stress-related medical conditions. His father was forced to resign from the powerful and high-paying position that he had abused to protect his son, and Issei's mother attempted to end her own life. And if our story ended here, it would still be one of the worst historic events I've ever recounted. But it did not. Though Issei claimed to be full of regret for his horrific crimes, every single action he took spoke otherwise. In the mid-80s, he wrote a book called In the Fog. It was published against the wishes of both his own family and the family of René Hartwelt. It is, essentially, a story of his crimes, written from his own perspective, along with hand-drawn pictures. It sold out across Japan. In fact, the Japanese public was so hungry for more of this lurid, disgusting content that he wrote a further 19 books about his crime. He appeared in nearly every form of media across Japan. Books, newspaper columns, magazine columns, and, perversely, restaurant reviews. He spoke at universities, set 2 stage shows, and appeared on television. The subject was always the same: murder, cannibalism. In addition to this horrifying form of celebrity, for that's surely what the Japanese public made him, he became a film star, of sorts. Sagawa went on to star in adult movies. He was often cast next to tall, fair, Western women. One such movie was even partially filmed in a Dutch-themed amusement park, a direct reference to René Hartwelt. Like everything else he touched following his horrific actions, the film sold well. Issei Sagawa passed away from complications from pneumonia at a hospital in Tokyo on November 24th, 2022, at the age of 73. He was never punished for what he did. He lived out the rest of his days in Tokyo, though he would often go into the vice district of the city to hire sex workers. He was even granted a passport so that he could take them on lavish vacations abroad, though not to France, of course. Sagawa's obsession changed as he aged, at least by degrees. He became obsessed with Japanese women instead, claiming them to be the most beautiful in the world, which meant he lived out the rest of his days surrounded by his obsession and his temptation. He would claim that simply being forced to make a living as a well-known murderer and cannibal was a terrible punishment in itself. It's at this point that I would normally like to speak about the victim of this horrible crime and give more details about René Hartwelt and how this indescribable miscarriage of justice by multiple governments affected her and her family. But at every given opportunity, her own family has declined to speak publicly about René and about what happened to her. So much so, in fact, that I had great difficulty in tracking down any remarks at all. I don't know why they made that decision, and I won't speculate, but I'm inclined to follow the lead of the victim's family on the topic. They did not wish to speak about their daughter in public or in regards to this case, and so I'll refrain from further commentary on her and her life. Thank you for listening. This has been a troubled past. What are your thoughts on the actions of the French and Japanese governments in this case? Why do you think the Japanese public was seemingly alright with elevating Issei Sagawa to the position of a public figure and celebrity? Let me know in the comments. If you'd like to hear more stories, please follow us on social media, and let me know if there are other topics you'd like to hear me cover in this way.